Welcome to Podcast is Code, a show about the operations side of the software development lifecycle. I'm Mitchell Scott.
And I'm Gabe Cook.
Today, we're going to talk about GitOps, but first, we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves. I graduated with a bachelor's in science and computer science, which I have not really ever used in industry. Right out of college, I worked at a network operations center for a tier 1 ISP, doing IP and Ethernet, circuit monitoring and configuration stuff in the NOC. I did that for about a year and a half, and then I kind of pivoted into doing IT work for an IT consultancy company, and kind of worked my way up from sysadmin to system engineer to like a solutions architect, and then I worked in the same company. I ran a managed service practice for Tableau Server, and that's kind of the first time I started getting involved in managing infrastructure in public clouds. So we did a lot of work in AWS, and then my background from before that, cloud-wise, was kind of VMware and on-prem servers and stuff like that. So I was with that company about 6 years, and then I started playing more with Docker and Kubernetes and wanted to transition into more of a DevOps role. And so I moved to my current job about 2 years ago, where I've been doing DevOps stuff. How about you, Gabe?
I actually started out not really related to DevOps at all, but started like repairing computers at a large unnamed computer repair retailer. I was there for like 5 years while I went through college and stuff. Shortly afterwards, started working on some of the like some government type websites. Pretty quickly got into DevOps, although there was a little transition period where I did like backend dev and then kind of UX stuff too. But I pretty quickly realized that the hosting side of things and the infrastructure was the most interesting to me. So I was there for a couple years. And then I, went to my most recent company where I, work kind of had to change the whole stack to get us into Kubernetes and a lot of, more cloud native hosted solutions. Been doing DevOps now for, I don't know, like 5 years. I think 5 years, 6 years, 5 years. So yeah, it's fun. It's my favorite part of the whole tech stack, definitely.
Yeah, I love the operations side. Let's do our list of questions. You want me to start asking you?
Yeah, go for it.
All right.
Do the first one.
What's the worst thing you've ever done to a production environment?
I don't want to do the first one. Okay. It's fine. It's not even that bad. I'm very meticulous, so I don't feel like I've ever done anything ridiculously bad. Knock on wood. But when I first was learning like cloud environments, when I first, got that DevOps job, was first dealing with AWS, I didn't realize how their load balancers worked. And so I was setting up a new service and I put a load balancer to terminate like on the user side and just grabbed the DNS records and threw them in DNS. And apparently AWS rotates those IP addresses occasionally. Just a little bit, like a week. Yeah, pretty commonly. So like a week later, it was just some random site. Nothing horribly bad, but it was not great. Luckily, this was, a new deployment. It wasn't just like the homepage of some site.
Nice. Mine's worse.
What did you do?
Okay, so we had a client it's for the running Tableau Server for the managed service, and we had to like RDP through dev to get to prod, like to their prod server. So I think it was either prod to dev or dev to prod. I can't remember, but we had to RDP through one environment to get to the other one. We didn't have access directly to the one. So I thought I was in dev, and I just made some configuration changes through some other system, but I was in the server to reboot it. I had to actually reboot the Windows box, right? Click reboot, and is it a reboot or I was restarting Tableau Server? I think it was a reboot, and it went to all the apps closed because Windows Server has a GUI. Stupid. all the apps closed, and the background, like the desktop wallpaper, was red, with like production across the top, because we had different wallpapers on production and non-prod. So I was like, oh, this is bad. Especially because Tableau Server takes like 15 minutes to start, or did at the time anyway. It took like 15 minutes to start. And this client was like, they'd have a minute or two outage, and like we'd be getting phone calls like, hey, server's down, what's up? So, yeah, I definitely restarted the prod environment, not during like a outage window or anything. So I think that's the worst. It was down for like it was down for like 15 minutes, and they actually did not notice, which is fantastic.
Nice. That could have been worse. Yeah, it's pretty important to split out those environments so things like that don't happen.
Not ideal.
And it sounds like you guys tried really hard with that wallpaper, but you didn't see that when you were pressing the reboot button.
No, there's too much other stuff open. All right, what's your favorite public cloud and why?
My favorite is, so we've kind of, Mitchell and I together, honestly, worked a lot in GCP in recent years, but my favorite's still AWS. I don't even know if I have any solid reasons. Maybe it's just I'm more familiar with it. I do like GCP's cleaner UI. I think it's a little more consistent, but AWS has been kind of upping their game with UI stuff recently. It's still the one that, like, personal projects, I go straight to AWS.
Yeah.
What about you?
I think I'll say Google Cloud, just because their UI is a little slicker,
Really?
and I've used it more like in the current job. There are some really, really nice AWS services. Like RDS is way better than Google's, like Cloud SQL. S3 is pretty comparable to like GCP's cloud storage. I wish GCP's cloud storage had like an S3 API, so you could use, almost every service that is compatible with object storage can use an S3 API, even if it's not S3. Like you can use Wasabi or Minio or whatever. But
they actually do. We used it for a short time when we first.
I didn't think it was
GCP.
It wasn't 100% though, right? Wasn't there some weird issues with it?
I guess I should have researched that ahead of time. Something was missing or like incompatible.
I should look at it again for sure. But yeah, but it's between GCP and AWS. I think GCP just because the better interface, and then AWS is a little more standard. It's easier to find people who have worked in it, and to hire for those jobs, because I'm like a hiring manager as well as DevOps nerd. Haven't played much with Azure. It's been a couple years since I really messed around with Azure, and everything seemed really verbose. It seemed like to create a load balancer, I had to create a ton of different objects and like name them all. And I wasn't totally sure like why I had to name individual subnets and things.
Yeah, Azure, I've never been a huge fan of all the horizontal scrolling, but they've added AKS, at some point in the past few years, and it's not terrible. I mean, I think AKS is comparable to EKS.
And that's kind of the thing, is I don't do a lot of cloud native services. Like I'm not building lambdas or cloud functions or anything. Pretty much everything I'm playing with is a container. So as long as I can get some form of like managed Kubernetes up and running, it doesn't really matter what the cloud platform is to me. Kubernetes is my new operating system for everything. Like that's my layer of abstraction.
Yeah, sorry, I should have also mentioned, I said AKS and EKS. Those are Kubernetes solutions in each of those clouds.
E for
AKS
Amazon and A
Kubernetes.
for Azure, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
That is the one thing I don't like about Amazon, is their names for stuff are horrible.
All over the place.
And the UI for CloudWatch is so bad. But yeah, the names are they don't make a lot of sense. What's your favorite language?
Oh, I mean, this is more dev related. It's Go. I love Go. I know I've been working with, computers and tech for a long time. So DevOps is like my main job, but I also like writing code. Go, I think, is by far my favorite, but I've really liked Python also in the past for like, scripts that I need to write. Or I've contributed to like the Home Assistant project a bit, and it was fun to write Python there.
Nice. Yeah. I think I'll say Python. I don't code much, like actual code. Like most of my coding is YAML for DevOps, right? Like it's not real coding. But probably Python. It's mostly like Bash and Python, honestly. I haven't compiled code in a long time. Like code that I've written probably since college.
Bash scripts are up there for me too. I enjoy writing pretty ridiculous but also powerful bash scripts.
Yeah.
But I
Bash,
don't know. I
Bash
always
gets
end up,
so ugly.
yeah, I end up hitting a point where it's like, what have I done? I can't even read this thing I wrote. And also the whole idea of everything's a string is cool, but there are times where it becomes a little annoying.
Yeah.
So usually I try to like grab Python or Go before I go straight to Bash, but there are times where it has use.
I will say as a scripting language, and this is, we don't talk about it, but like PowerShell's pretty good as a scripting language. It's a completely horrible shell, but like as a scripting language, it is all like natively object oriented. And if you have to do a bunch of stuff in Windows land, it can make it nicer.
You always say that. I have no input. I've never really used PowerShell much, except when I accidentally open it instead of a command prompt
like, why
in
is
Windows,
this
and I'm like,
blue?
oh, what am I doing? It's blue, which I like, but otherwise I'm lost. But yeah, so how long have you been using Linux?
I've been playing with Linux since 2005. I started with a Red Hat version, or I guess it was Fedora probably. It was a CD, and so I did an internship at a bank, and this IT guy had this like Linux Bible on his bookshelf, and it had an actual physical CD with probably Fedora on it. I think it was like
Nice.
I don't even know what version. And then shortly after that, I played with a lot of different OSs trying to get Windows off my laptop. And this was back in the days when like you did mess around with like NDIS wrapper for Wi-Fi and ALSA for sound, which was horrible on laptops, and the touchpads hardly ever worked. So I ended up I think it would have been 2006. I got Ubuntu had where you could put in your address and they'd mail you like 10 CDs for free. And I had really horrible internet at the time, so pretty much I was limited to what I could get from friends or like Ubuntu mailed me a CD. So I installed the original LTS of Ubuntu 6.06 because it was a weird June release. They were late by 2 months. And I think it was Dapper Drake, maybe, was 6.06. So that's my first version of Ubuntu. And I've used Ubuntu pretty much since then, especially for servers. What about you?
I'm pretty similar, actually. I don't have an exact year. I started off kind of because of my dad. When I was pretty young, I think we had a computer die and he built a new one, and he was like, why should I have to pay for my OS? So instead of installing Windows, we started playing with Linux. Although we maybe started a little earlier than that. There was this awesome project, which I think I've seen their website recently. It's still out there, called Myth TV. It's an early version of, like Plex basically, but it's like for live TV specifically. So we ran that. We started with Fedora and Myth TV, and then we found there was an OS called Mythdora probably around the same time, like 2004. So it was cool that like back then, before DVRs, like recording TV and skipping ads was very common. Like we had all of that.
Yeah, that's cool.
Eventually we moved to Mythbuntu, and I think that's when the whole why should I have to rebuy Windows? I'm just going to install Ubuntu on our personal computer happened. And so I pretty much grew up using it. I'm kind of more familiar with Linux than Windows. I went through small phases here and there, like around probably 2016. I used Arch for a few years, and eventually I was like, I'll just swap back to Ubuntu. It wasn't bad. I enjoyed it a lot, but I think I was using a fork which got like Antergos, which stopped being maintained at some point, so I just swapped back to Ubuntu. But yeah, it's been quite a long time. I like it a lot.
What's your like daily driver OS these days?
Man, it depends on what we're talking about. I didn't really grow up with any Apple products, so I mean, like I said, I kind of grew up solidly on Linux, but recent years, the like M1 and M2 Macs are just so solid. I've been using a MacBook for a while now and super happy with it. I mean, having Unix instead of Linux causes some interesting issues. Like, Docker doesn't work perfectly. And like, personally, I'm a huge fan of containers. So that has been a little interesting to have to work around. But like overall, the, terminal is basically what I know. So I love my Mac. Now, I do also have a bunch of servers at home, and those are Ubuntu server. So definitely, I like Ubuntu security updates and stuff like that. What about you? I feel like you're in a similar boat.
Yeah, I'm using. I think every PC in my house, every like computer is a Mac at this point.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know the last time I actually bought owned a personal Windows machine. I've had work Windows machines over the years, like work issued laptops and stuff that were Windows.
Yeah.
I went through a time, so until relatively recently, I didn't have like a personal like laptop. I just used work issued stuff, and then I had like servers or desktops. Mostly servers, actually. I haven't had a real desktop in a while either. I had a Mac Pro that I turned into a server. But yeah, no, all my personal like computing devices are MacBooks. Similarly, I like that it's kind of Nix under the hood.
Yeah.
It is a little different. It is also, it's really nice. You can run commercial software. Like, big fan of Affinity. If I had to run like Photoshop definitely. Or something, I could. So that's kind of nice. Whereas sometimes getting that stuff to work on Linux is a huge pain. But similar to you, all my servers are Ubuntu. So yeah, Apple on the desktop, Ubuntu on the servers.
I would be curious. So I forgot to mention, I have a gaming desktop over here that I don't use too much lately because I got a Steam Deck. But this thing has Windows, but I can dual boot to Linux. And on both this and my Steam Deck, I have, all of Valve's, like basically new kind of tooling on top of Wine, so you can like play Windows games on Linux.
The Steam Deck runs Arch, right? Or an Arch derivative?
Yeah, they just are like, let's ship a product with Arch. It's great.
That's awesome. I actually do have a Pinebook Pro laptop that runs Manjaro on it, so it's Arch-ish.
Nice.
And it also has Kubernetes on it, so it's fine.
Yes. Bring it back to DevOps.
Yeah, you wanna talk about what gear you run at home?
Oh shoot, yeah, I talked about my servers a little. I gave a little sneak peek. Yeah, so I have honestly like not any fancy server hardware. I follow like some DevOps, like the subreddit and some other communities online, and I keep seeing people post their fancy server racks, but I just have some old desktops, honestly, like slim line desktops, and I have Kubernetes clusters on them. Or just one Kubernetes cluster between all these nodes. I've recently been swapping them out, buying like the tiny PCs, like those Lenovo tiny PC, and I have an HP, and it's been really fun to swap to smaller form factor. Just they have a cuteness factor that I love. Plus, they're a little bit newer tech, but yeah, that's most of it on the hardware side. Then software is just all Kubernetes magic. What do you have?
So I've got two Dell R610s, like single rack unit servers. I think they're over 10 years old now. I think they're from like 2011 or something. So, and I got those for free when I was doing a data center upgrade as part of my when I was doing IT work. The customer we replaced these machines with like a bunch of newer servers, and the guy was like, "I'm gonna throw these away." And I said, "Like, can I have them?" He's like, "Yeah, just give me the hard drives, and you can have the servers. No big deal." So they've each got they've got two. Each server has two 6-core Xeon processors in it. Each server has 96 gigabytes of memory. So total, I've got 24 cores, 24 physical cores, and 192 gigs of RAM. They're kind of expensive to run. I think my power bill for those guys is like $30 or $40 a month. So I'm actually similar to what you've been doing. I'm looking at downsizing into those small like Lenovo little mini PCs. And then I'll shut the big servers off unless I really need a lot of compute to run VMs or something. And I used to use a lot more resources, but I've moved from VMs to containers, and I use a ton less like system resources. So those servers are only running at like 20 or 30% of memory and a lot less CPU. So I don't need 200 watts a piece for those guys. And then I also have a couple Synology NASs for storage and stuff. And then I've got some Juniper networking gear that I bought when I was working at the ISP because most of our stuff was Juniper. It's also really, really old. All my stuff is pretty old at this point. I guess my NASs are the newest one's 6 years old, I think, or 7 years old. So it's all getting a little old, but that stuff's expensive.
Yeah, well, and that's what I love about, I guess in your case, it's not Linux all the way down, but Linux is so light compared to, like, if you take an old Windows computer, which is, laggy and not working well, and you throw Linux on there, you'd probably be surprised as to, like, how well it works.
Well, and, like, my servers don't even have hard drives in them. I'm booting VMware off a USB stick in each of them. So, like, they don't even have hard disks. But yeah, and so VMware, its kernel's Linuxy. I don't exactly know what ESXi is. But it's some flavor of Unix or Linux. So yeah, everything runs just fine. It's just now it's at the point that I'm paying a lot for power, and they can get kind of loud. What IDE are you using these days?
So I'm actually like in the process of trying to change IDEs.
I guess maybe we should define what an IDE is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so what's it actually stand for?
It's
something integrated development environment, I think? Or integrated development environment. It's like a text editor, basically, but it's like strongly meant for editing code. It has, completing things that look like, if you start trying to log output, it probably knows how to write a log, and it's like, oh yeah, here's how you do that. So lots of autocomplete, lots of tabs and stuff. It's a lot more advanced than Notepad. So I've been using kind of the IntelliJ suite of editors for a long time, and I really love them. I still like them a lot. I've been trying out recently VS Code, because there's a lot of hype for VS Code online. I tried it probably
is IntelliJ
years ago.
JetBrains?
Yeah.
JetBrains, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, JetBrains is the company and IntelliJ is kind of the product. And then they have all these different editors like, PyCharm and PHP Storm and GoLand, which are all just kind of pre-configured versions.
That whole like ecosystem's paid, right? Like you buy licenses for those?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it starts at like their price went up a little bit recently. It's a few $100s a year if you want all the full suite.
Oh, a subscription, Adobe style.
Yeah, it's recurring. So that's why I've been trying to see if VS Code can fit in my workflow instead. Like, if I get all the features that I use and it's free, then that's awesome. But I do kind of have a soft spot for IntelliJ, so we'll see how this goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
What have you been using?
Oh, I've been using VS Code for a few years. I pretty much went from, so like all throughout school, like in my like college, like my CS program, I didn't use a single editor. I used Vim for everything. Like I never learned how to use an IDE. It was like use Vim and then in a different like terminal tab, compile like Java or whatever. So that's how I learned. And then Vim. I kind of did that for a while until I got out of doing like writing any code or even like infrastructure as code stuff until I got back into. Also, it started with like PowerShell stuff at the other company when I was writing backup scripts and maintenance scripts for Tableau Server. I started needing something that was more than like a text editor. So like Notepad++ for a little while, and then quickly moved to VS Code. I actually tried Atom for a brief time, which was that cheeky little editor, also an Electron, that GitHub was writing before they got eaten by Microsoft, and Microsoft is the maker of VS Code.
Atom was really, I mean, maybe VS Code existed at the time, but I kind of feel like Atom came out before VS Code. I used it back when it first.
They definitely coexisted for a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I was looking at Sublime for the Mac, but we ran Windows also, and I don't remember if Sublime even had a Windows version. But I wanted something that was a little more open and cross-platform, so I looked at Atom because I wasn't sure about like a Microsoft product. And then I just started using VS Code to try it, and it was really, really nice. And I feel like they did Electron a little better than Atom. Like VS Code has always kind of felt native. It doesn't feel like an Electron app, which is crazy. I don't know what Microsoft's doing behind the scenes there, but it runs really smooth.
Magic. No, it's definitely, I think, the most solid Electron app I've ever seen. Because, for people not familiar with Electron, that's JavaScript. It's not anything native.
It's Chrome
to your machine. Yeah, it's basically a Chrome instance running.
It's an
JavaScript,
outdated, probably security vulnerable version of Chrome in each of your applications.
Hopefully not, but it's blazing fast. It's pretty impressive.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have. Let's move over to talk about some current events. You saw the whole RHEL debacle, right? Red Hat Linux source code changing.
So my history is more, with Ubuntu and things, although I've used CentOS a bit, but I don't know as much about kind of RHEL licensing and stuff.
Yeah, I could give a little history because it was one of the supported platforms we ran Tableau on. So I knew a little bit about it because clients would say I don't want to use Ubuntu. I want to use Red Hat or CentOS or whatever. So CentOS, I've heard it both ways. I don't know the correct pronunciation.
Me neither.
Let us know in the comments. So I think it's been a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I don't remember the timeline. So for a long time, RHEL, Red Hat shipped CentOS, which was pretty much, it was binary compatible with Red Hat. You basically had free Red Hat that was not supported by the company Red Hat. And so a lot of people would use that because they would have systems they paid Red Hat licensing for, and they'd have systems they didn't care about as much, like dev stuff. And so they'd run CentOS on that. And then 3 years ago, Red Hat, the company, they came out and they said hey, CentOS is going to become the upstream of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, of RHEL.
Oh, so it's like a bleeding edge version.
Yeah, so CentOS became a little more bleeding edge. It's no longer one-to-one compatible with Red Hat necessarily because it may be on a newer code base. Not that, a fine business decision, I suppose. But some people didn't like that. So a couple of projects spun up immediately after, Rocky Linux, and I think Alma was the other one. And they are basically building one-to-one binary compatible distros with Red Hat Enterprise Linux if you want to do that. So on June 22nd, Red Hat changed how you can access their source code. I believe previously, and I'm not an expert with Red Hat, like you said, we don't really use Red Hat. My understanding is Red Hat changed so that for instead of anybody being able to get Red Hat source code, only subscribers, paying customers, can get it. And it appears that is totally fine, per the GPL. As long as you provide code to your customers, that satisfies your GPL requirements. You don't have to provide your source code to everyone. That does pose a problem for the Rocky Linux people and the Alma people who are still trying to build distros based on those packages that they now no longer have access to as non-paying. They're not RHEL customers. They're not Red Hat Enterprise Linux customers. The interesting thing I read, everyone was kind of waiting for Rocky Linux's, in particular, their response. And they posted it on June 29th. So about a little less than a week later, or right at a week later. And that was kind of interesting. I don't really want to get into the whole licensing. Is the licensing cool thing or not? That's not my area. One thing I did notice.
It's always a gray area.
Yeah. Anyway. One thing I did notice in their blog post, though, is they mentioned using CI, so continuous integration, to kind of get around some of these requirements. I'm going to read a little bit from their blog, and we'll link their blog post in the show notes. So they said, another method that we will leverage is pay-per-use public cloud instances. With this, anyone can spin up RHEL images in the cloud and thus obtain the source code for all packages and errata. This is the easiest for us to scale, as we can do all of this through CI pipelines, spinning up cloud images to obtain the sources via DNF and post to our Git repos automatically. And I thought that was a super interesting use of because you can do the same thing with, it's a little different because it's not Linux. You can do the same thing with Windows. You can go ask Amazon for a Windows box and you'll just pay more per hour to cover the licensing cost. I guess you can do the same thing with RHEL, which totally makes sense. But that's kind of a creative way to use like DevOps pipelines to pay Red Hat without getting into an agreement directly with them. So I just thought that was super interesting.
That's amazing. It's also feels like it's very much a gray area, but I think that's a really cool like DevOps solution to more
well, and that they can script the whole thing, right? Like that just seems really interesting. That was a fascinating way to solve that problem, and a really creative one, which is like that's the fun part of DevOps is like all these creative solutions, sometimes janky to like actual problems.
But it actually, hey, if it works, it actually works. I'd like to keep an eye on their blog and see if they end up doing it that way, or
and how long like that works for them.
Yeah. Cool. There was also a pretty big GitLab outage like just a couple of days ago.
Yeah, so I saw that. We don't really use GitLab, like the online, like the hosted version of GitLab. We have a couple of customers who use self-hosted GitLab instances. But I saw that. How long did it end up being down for?
The number on there, it felt like a long time. It was near the end of the day. I remember that they posted a whole postmortem here. It looks like it was about 4 hours, a little under 4 hours. It's a long time, but it happens sometimes in the DevOps world. It
was on last Friday, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was on the July 7th.
Oh man, yeah, they were down like half of Friday, like like half of business hours, like U.S. business hours Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess GitLab does not subscribe to read-only Fridays.
No, GitLab's actually, they constantly push to their code base. They've been a pretty big fighter for, heavy testing and heavy CI/CD reliance. Somewhere in their docs, they say they push to prod like dozens of times per day.
Yeah,
maybe the number
which is
more
great.
Than that.
Like
I can't remember.
I joke a little bit about like the read-only Friday thing, but like if you're doing DevOps correctly, like Friday pushes, and especially if you have any kind of testing involved, like that's kind of not a thing. Like pushing on Fridays is whatever.
Yeah. If you're able to get good test coverage and everything, but in this case, I mean, it shows that not everything is perfect, even with solid tests and pretty
did they say what went wrong?
Process. It looks like they had basically applied some obsolete Terraform plan output, which when the job began, pretty quickly started reverting something. It looks like they caught on to it pretty quickly.
But then they had to go figure out what the old Terraform changed and then fix it.
Yeah, basically what got reverted.
Oh, man.
Yeah, they say they spent some time trying to fix their Terraform and get a better handle on how a restore would need to work. And then they eventually got brought back up. But
yeah, we'll put the link to they use their own, like the GitLab.com as a repo. They have like an issue template for their outages that they update. And I will say, companies go down. Like that's just something that happens, like inadvertently, like stuff's going to break. I will say it was refreshing to see them post publicly, like their in progress postmortem. Cause like they've been filling out this issue, like since I saw it, I think on Saturday. So it looks like a good example of how to do a blameless postmortem. They're going through like, here's the timelines. Here's what happened. That's kind of in contrast to like what AWS has been doing lately, and they had an outage earlier in June of US East 1, of course, because of course it was. But I looked a little bit. I couldn't find any write up of like what went wrong for them that day. So it is nice to see a company who's like, hey, we were down. Here's what happened. Here's how we fixed it. And I'm a big proponent of doing blameless postmortems. For almost any instance.
Mm-hmm. GitLab's been especially transparent, I think, with, what causes outages. They had this big database issue where they actually lost a lot of their production database, maybe last year or the year before. And the postmortem for it was very detailed We can provide a link to that too. But like, I came out of that not being nervous for their, service uptime, but the complete opposite. Like, wow, they were confident enough to say, oh yeah, we deleted some of our prod data. Here's how we fixed it.
Yeah.
And
I like that, because it's the same thing you see with security incidents. Like at some point, every company is going to have some sort of security issue. And it's not really, the measure of a company isn't like who has the problems, it's how they respond to them. And it's similar for outages too. Because like if GitLab.com being up is critical for your operations, like GitHub is for us. Like if GitHub was down for 4 hours, a lot of our company can't be productive. So, if we had used GitLab instead, like that's a big problem. That's a big hit to confidence in your vendor. I didn't look offhand. I don't know if GitLab provides SLAs, like service level agreements for uptime. If they do, I bet those are blown for a little while.
Yeah, I think they do for their higher paid tiers, but
and to be clear, this impacted everyone. Yeah. Like it was all GitLab services, even the website, completely down for like 4 hours. It's a big deal. I think,
and yeah, you mentioned it being in contrast to some other vendors. I was going to say that AWS outage, we were actually kind of planning to talk on that. I remember AWS had a big outage, a few years ago, and there was some really interesting postmortems afterwards. But I went out to look for that one too, and the last one I saw was like December 2021.
Yeah, that's disappointing.
And I know they've had some outages since then. Again, that's not, no knock on the service, but it's frustrating to me. Another good vendor with outages has always been Cloudflare. Theirs aren't as real time, but I'm always blown away by the detail they provide after some sort of outage.
Yep. So, I mean, I will say, like, if, we use GitHub, some people probably use GitLab, other people use self-hosted stuff. So unfortunately, if you're, if your version of GitLab goes down for 4 hours, that may be on you to fix, not on the vendor, right? I guess it's just one of those kind of risk assessments you have to do of like, if the company provides you SLAs, if it's like 3 nines, 99.9% uptime, you have to be okay with the maximum downtime you could get in a period. And if you're not, you need to architect around that with, like, we mirror some of our critical repositories elsewhere, because, if something happens, that code is like that's the business, right? So, 4 hours, we could probably tolerate not being able to run CI/CD for 4 hours. 4 days, absolutely not. That's unacceptable. And if we didn't have a way to revert, like to switch off of that to another platform, then like that's a big problem. Of course, like we have to trust a little bit in our agreements. Like GitHub for us, I think is 3 nines of availability. So like if they're down for 4 hours, like our company's getting reimbursed for that. But again, like, what you pay for GitHub or GitLab or whatever, you may get reimbursed for like what you pay monthly. That may not cover your actual cost of downtime. So that's another thing, kind of on the business side of the operations side of this stuff, is what you get reimbursed for. It may be a fraction of like your, downtime for your customers that you may have to pay their agreements back, stuff like that. Just stuff to think about. When these big platforms go down, is always a good reminder to go look at your vendor agreements, look at how you've architected stuff, and just make sure if that outage happened on your platform, have you thought about the implications of it? That sort of stuff.
Yeah, have a backup plan.
Yep. And at least if you're gonna take the risk of being in a single vendor, like, make that decision consciously. All right. Our main topic today is GitOps. What is GitOps?
Oh, it's hard to explain. It's a whole mentality, I feel like. It really is kind of a mindset of, instead of manually deploying things to, it's kind of become a topic that's related to Kubernetes. So instead of just manually deploying things to Kubernetes willy-nilly, you have a Git repo, and it's all kind of initiated by Git, which is your source of truth. So everything running in your Kubernetes cluster, you can trace back to this Git repo. And if you lose your cluster, I mean, hopefully you have data backups, but that repo should define, here's all the applications I need, all the configuration, and all of that. So it's kind of like infrastructure as code, but in Kubernetes. So there's been a big push for it over the last couple of years. Yeah.
So you mentioned infrastructure as code. Let's talk about that for a minute. So when we say infrastructure as code, we're meaning like kind of declarative infrastructure. So it's not like do this. You don't write like do this. You write be this, right?
Like this is what I want. Yeah.
Yeah. So and infrastructure as code also typically brings with it like the concept of version control, whether that's Git or like Subversion or whatever, right? In this case, we're talking about Git specifically. And then also continuous delivery, which is automated processes to make your declarations happen in the real world or the virtual world of like your servers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and infrastructure as code didn't originally really even relate to Kubernetes. I mean, it might have more history than I'm even aware of, but it, at least, in my experience, was a cloud native term. So you make infrastructure as code to say, like I want these servers in AWS and I want this load balancer. And now it kind of works for Kubernetes too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think kind of more traditional or maybe a little bit older infrastructure as code tools would be stuff like AWS's CloudFormation, which is their special sauce infrastructure as code. I haven't actually messed with CloudFormation much because it looks like a huge mess. It just looks really verbose, like when you have it generate it.
I think.
Oh, gross. And then kind of the other big one is HashiCorp's Terraform, right? Which is vendor agnostic. You can kind of write once, use multiple places, although some of the modules are a little specific. So if you squint, you can do that. But it is open source, so you could write Terraform against Azure, GCP, AWS, VMware, your mom's laptop. Like there's a ton of modules. It's been around a long time. They hit their like 1.0 stable version, I don't know, like 2 years ago, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was in beta before then.
Yeah,
but
But I think
been used for many years now.
Yeah.
And it has a plugin architecture too, so Terraform is pretty cool. You can hook in whatever you want.
Yeah.
But it's not GitOps.
It's not GitOps, although it's not necessarily like mutually exclusive from GitOps.
No, I think both are really good resources. GitOps is more, the actual applications if you use Kubernetes. And then, like just traditional infrastructure as code with like Terraform is useful for all the cloud things that you need.
Yeah, it seems like Terraform's a really good like foundation or first step. And then if you're dealing with traditional servers, a lot of times you'll see Terraform pivot into Ansible for configuration management. But if you're deploying workloads into Kubernetes, I think Terraform will pivot into a GitOps kind of workflow for that second stage, like stage 2.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, under GitOps, it's really nice because you don't... It's obviously still useful to be able to get into the cluster, but you don't necessarily need to connect to the cluster directly to do things.
Right. So that sounds like... So if you're using some other way to get application manifests into Kubernetes, if you're doing that in a CI/CD pipeline, that pipeline would have to authenticate like into your Kubernetes cluster,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
So with GitOps, you don't have to. You kind of switch from a push-based like deployment to a pull-based one, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a lot more secure. Your source code repository doesn't even have to have access into your hosting infrastructure. Your hosting infrastructure will just see that there was an update and it'll pull that.
Yeah, that's really nice from both the just pain of managing like logging into different providers, but also like you said, the security aspect of, do you want people to be able to write CI jobs that have access to your repository secrets that include login information for your clusters? Probably not.
You also don't want your clusters like API endpoint to be publicly available.
That's a good point too, right? And there've been pretty well documented attacks or vulnerabilities with Kubernetes APIs when those do get exposed publicly by companies, right? Like,
yeah, and usually it's pretty, pretty locked down. You need a client certificate and things. But I mean, in the past, like you said, there have been security issues, even just due to misconfiguration. And the response really is like, well, that's not supposed to be public, so make it private. So
yeah, it's if you have a pull-based approach, you have like less of your infrastructure directly on the surface prone to attack, right? Yeah. Even no matter how well Kubernetes secures their API, like stuff's gonna happen. Stuff always happens. Mm-hmm. Like it's a big software project. There's a lot of complexity. I mean, we've seen stuff with like just how OpenSSH and OpenSSL have had vulnerabilities over the years, just because of like these large open source projects. Stuff gets missed. Bugs happen. So yeah, that seems like a really good benefit to doing GitOps.
Another nice thing that you get with GitOps is eliminating configuration drift. So I've seen in the past, like deployments where, when I first used Kubernetes, a lot of my deployment jobs would just authenticate into the cluster and then basically tell it, hey, there's a new version of this app available, use this new Docker image. And that worked fine. But if you start changing configuration and you don't update whatever manifests are in Git, then you don't actually know what's been changed. And most of the GitOps tools will actively check for changes in the cluster that aren't reflected in the Git repository and revert them so that Git is the source of truth. So it's nice to be able to eliminate that. Yeah,
this has happened to us before, right? Like if we have, for some projects, we would store the deployment like infrastructure as code, which is kind of a Terraform based thing, and Terraform and Helm. Helm is quote unquote a package manager for Kubernetes. It's more of a templating engine. But it's a really useful tool for sure. But the way like we would store infrastructure, like application manifest type stuff alongside application code. And a struggle we had in the past was we had some apps with really long build times. But if we wanted to change infrastructure as code stuff, like environment variable stuff like that, that doesn't actually require an application build unless you happen to tie everything together like we did. And then you're waiting 5 minutes for a build to update like an environment variable.
Like a URL or something.
Right, exactly. So what would happen is we're lazy, right? We don't want to wait on that thing. Either we're lazy or there's a pressing need to change something and we don't want to wait on a build. So we go into the cluster and change it, like edit the deployment, which is fine until the dev pushes a fix 2 weeks later and your infrastructure change gets overwritten because you forgot to go commit it back into the repository. And then like whatever you changed just got reverted, and like you can fix it. It's not that big a deal. Everything is in version control, but it's a pain, and you might break. Like that dev may push something on a Friday night because they're working late, and I don't want to be working on a Friday night to go refix the thing I was supposed to fix 2 weeks ago, right? So yeah, that detecting and resolving like configuration drift is super useful because it makes you work really hard to do it wrong. Like most of these tools have a way to like pause their reconciliation loops and go actually edit stuff, so you have that like control if you need it. But that's kind of a pain. And so you won't do it unless you absolutely have to. And like it's easier to do it the right way. And making it easier to do it the right way means that like there's just less risk of stuff drifting over time. And it means that at any time, what's in version control is what's in the cluster, to the point that if you want to see how an app's configured, you can look at the Git repo. You don't have to log into the cluster to see it. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So with that, kind of the, ongoing check everything that's running and revert any changes. If you, do something like that, it would get reverted in usually like a few minutes. So
yeah.
You would know before Friday night comes around.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. Well, and then another benefit of having everything in Git is you can give devs access, like read-only access to it, or you can give them write access to, especially like dev, like right?
The dev site
environments. Yeah. And then they don't have to understand Kubernetes. They don't have to have a login to Kubernetes. They can make changes on the dev, like on the development environments, infrastructure as code, without having to like bring in the operations team. And for some stuff, that's really valuable. Because at least at our company, like the operations team's pretty small compared to how many devs we have because we're at a custom software shop. So we got a lot of devs doing a lot of stuff. We have a handful of operations folks. And it's not that I don't want them to bother me because they're my customers, right? They're internal, but they're my customers. And I like all our devs. I don't want them to have to get out of their flow, nail down one of our operations people, like pull us out of whatever we're doing and get them to fix the thing. Like it's not like a personnel problem because all of our, we all work really well together, but it's every step in that process takes time and it's a context switch. And that also costs a lot of time. So like if a dev wants to make like a 5-minute environment variable change or URL change or whatever, it could take them like half an hour to get one of us able to talk them through how to do it or do it for them. And so the more stuff that our developers can like self-service, that just speeds up their development. It lets us focus on kind of more big picture stuff as opposed to just doing like onesie twosie, like helping out the devs tasks. It's really nice. It's really nice when the developers are empowered to go do the thing they need to do, and there's not a lot of roadblocks in their way.
Yeah, and with the alerting and things, they can even know if they've made a change that worked and got deployed or if it failed. So yeah, that's definitely valuable. And then kind of as a final point that came to mind for us, it also, then you have Git history that perfectly lines up with what was in your cluster at that point in time. I mentioned I host Kubernetes here at home. I host a ton of apps, and there have been times where I don't need an app and I get rid of it. And then 6 months later, I'm like, let me try that guy out again. And I can just do a git log, find where I deleted it, and then revert that. And so it's really nice to have sort of that history, which also gives you an audit trail and even just like permissions. Mitchell mentioned allowing devs to touch dev sites. And well, you can do that with Git. You can, create code owners and say, okay, devs can change the dev version of the site, but not prod without like DevOps approval.
Yeah. Well, and that's the cool thing is you can use Git PR approval process. So you could have devs even propose changes to the production environment and just require a member of the operations team review and approve the PR. Or
exactly.
Pull request in GitHub land, merge request in GitLab land. And it kind of enables some asynchronous approval and collaboration without having to, talk with someone in Slack or get them on a call.
Yeah. There are some challenges to it. It has a pretty steep learning curve and a lot of initial time invested into it. I still don't feel like my personal fleet info or the one that we work on, for work is perfect. There's always some learning to do and cleaning it up and making it all look nice and easy to work with.
Yeah, I feel like early on there can be some almost like decision paralysis where it's like staring at a blank sheet of paper or a blank repository and trying to figure out how do you organize all of your applications, all your infrastructure and everything. It can be a challenge. And we've redone ours a couple times. So I think to that, I would say just pick a direction, go down it. And when it stops working for you or when it gets painful, look at something different.
Yeah.
Because you're right. It is it is a big initial time investment, but on the flip side, it starts paying dividends immediately. Like the first deployment may take you a week. The second one will take you 3 minutes. Like it's like that level of just like speed up after you get it done. Yeah. It's incredible. And as if you go through setting up one of these tools, at first it'll be, you'll be asking yourself like, is this worth it? This seems like a lot. It's a lot of nuances to learn, a lot of pieces to get in position. But man, once it's working, it's a force multiplier for sure.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need to be perfect either. Like you mentioned kind of analysis paralysis. That happens a lot to me. I tend to overthink things and want to do them right the first time, but sometimes that ends up taking longer than if I had just done it wrong and then figured out what was wrong and then refactored it to be right. So yeah, I would say, check out the docs for one of the tools. We'll mention a lot of them that we're using in a bit.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have kind of recommended, like, here's some ways you could structure your repository.
Yep. Another thing we ran into is some of the tools don't, and GitOps kind of by itself doesn't solve for secrets. GitOps in itself is not opinionated about secrets. It doesn't care where they live. There's a lot of different ways to solve for secrets as part of a GitOps workflow. We are using, in a lot of places, we're using Mozilla SOPs.
Yeah, I love SOPs.
To encrypt secrets and store them in Git. So actually, our secrets live encrypted alongside the infrastructure as code, which I think is really cool. For some of our clients, we use like PGP for that encryption. Others, we use like the cloud native KMS tools like GCP KMS or AWS KMS. That works really well for us. You could totally use something like HashiCorp's Vault or some other secret store externally to Git. You don't have to get your secrets into Git.
No.
But that is one thing to be aware of. Now, what I would recommend is definitely don't just keep them like, if you're using Kubernetes, don't just keep them as like native Kubernetes objects. That is kind of an anti-pattern for any infrastructure as code, because if something happened to your cluster or something happened to etcd, you would lose that data, right? Yeah. You'd lose those secrets. So you want it somewhere outside of kind of just almost anything running inside Kubernetes itself should probably be considered at some level kind of ephemeral. And that's kind of back to the old backups, like best practices of if you have something in one place, you have it in none places, right? You want backups. Yep. So for us, Git is actually secret backups. Like secrets live in Git. They're in version control. They're just fully encrypted. And for a lot of them, we're using the Cloud KMS tool. So,
and again, then we have history too on secrets.
Exactly. Yeah, that is pretty cool.
Fashion. It's awesome.
So that's something to be aware of. You want to plan out how you manage secrets if you move your workloads into GitOps. Lots of different tools out there to help you with that, but GitOps in itself, especially, we'll talk about a couple tools. One of them in particular does not solve for secrets very well, and then one of them does.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah. Kind of like we mentioned with the rapid reversion of changes, is if you or your team is used to hopping into clusters via kubectl and just issuing changes willy-nilly, you're going to want to break that habit.
That was us.
Or it'll get broken for you hard. Yeah. So the first time you'll scale down a deployment. I still do this. I forget. And I'll like kubectl scale deployment replica 0. And then in like 30 seconds it's back up and I'm like, what are you doing? I told you to die.
Did I not just scale? Am I crazy? No.
But especially if you have static manifests in these in GitOps, they will get reverted within seconds. Some of the Helm stuff can take a little longer for it to figure it out and reconcile it away. But that is a challenge if you're really used to just hopping in directly into the cluster and making stuff happen. You'll need to kind of break that habit to take full advantage of these tools for sure.
Yeah. And then your manifests kind of are now subject to like the change management process. You have to figure out like what sort of protections to put on that infrastructure Git repository. Do we require some people to approve before I can merge in a change? Things like that. But I think that's kind of a benefit. The fact that you can do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I can see it both ways, because there's a lot of operations people don't want to be encumbered with change management. They just want to like, I know what's wrong, let me go fix it.
Yeah.
But especially as like a company grows, once you start looking at certain kind of compliance regulations, like an ironclad change management process should be at least be a conversation you have as your company like matures to that level. And having a way to get your infrastructure to conform to that process is definitely a pro, but let's not fool ourselves. Like that's going to add complexity and time and a little bit of frustration to your lives.
Well, and you also still need some sort of a break glass key. Like if something's broken, right, you need to be able to get in at some level to fix it. So
yeah,
it's definitely a balancing act. Another thing actually that we should have mentioned earlier, I forgot to list, that's pretty useful about GitOps is you can, with Kubernetes, you can have multiple nodes, like multiple computers in a single cluster. That's why it's called a Kubernetes cluster. But if you have multiple clusters, historically, it's been kind of hard to manage applications. But GitOps makes it possible to define an application in one place and then have multiple clusters use that same configuration. So it kind of helps manage multiple clusters, which we've actually done. I do that at home. I was
gonna say, we've architected and built a solution like for a client that relies heavily on that feature. And I'm sure at some point we'll dive deeper into, not client specifics, but like how we architected their solution and utilize that feature. But it is super useful. And you said you're doing that at home?
Yeah, well, I was going to say I do that at home a little bit. Like, I have my Ingress configuration and, Cert Manager, which issues certificates. And I use that same configuration for my home cluster and then a VPS, like a cloud server that I pay for. And then I was going to mention, we've also done that for a much more important scenario of kind of hosting an app in 2 data centers in case one goes down. So that's a big benefit that in the past, I guess you'd deploy your app to both clusters at the same time, but it would be hard to manage. So that's a big selling point.
So we've kind of danced around what the tools are. Do you want to?
Yeah. So the big 2, I'm sure there are more, but you always hear like Argo CD and Flux CD. I can't speak to Argo too much. You might have to talk on that here in a minute. I kind of settled on Flux, and that's what we've ended up using for work. Very powerful tool. But you used Argo. Is it pretty similar, but a little different?
It's pretty similar. Argo has the advantage of it does have a pretty decent UI that lets you see all your Kubernetes workloads and stuff. So if you want like a Kubernetes dashboard, it's not really designed to be that, but it can kind of function as that. So you can see all of your apps, your deployments, everything grouped by your Argo application. There were some stuff I didn't like about it. And this may have gotten better. I haven't used Argo in a year and a half or so. At the time, it had some pretty limited ways to reference Helm values. And this is getting kind of deep into Argo.
Yeah.
It also doesn't really solve the secrets problem at all. Or at least it didn't when I played with it. There were some ways to try to add plugins to like Argo's Helm binaries and stuff like that. It seemed really technical, like even for what I was doing. And I kind of got to the point that I wasn't a big fan of Argo CD. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's working great for people. I may have been holding it wrong. It was the first GitOps tool I played with. So some of that was undoubtedly on me being new to these tools. It does have a nice UI for some people, Gabe. That's not a point in its favor.
No, usually
I will say at the time the UI did not work at all on mobile. So, and I know it's weird, why would you want to manage a cluster on your phone? But I do that a lot.
Useful if you're on vacation and something weird happens. It's nice to have a UI.
Especially because their UI is really pretty and it's not super technical. It's all kind of block based. So it seems like it would be fine on a phone, but it didn't work well on a phone. Again, that may have changed. It's been a while, and a year or so in DevOps tool time is a long time.
That's true. It's probably a whole different UI now. Who knows?
Could be.
I remember actually. I did try Argo a bit. You're right. There were some limitations with Helm, but overall it felt really powerful. The UI was pretty cool. We kind of ended up settling on Flux. Personally, I really love Flux. Again, I haven't used Argo much, so I can't compare, but that's kind of what I used first, and I just stuck with it. The reason I originally went with Flux CD was because I use Helm for pretty much everything I deploy, which is that package manager / kind of templating for Kubernetes tool that we mentioned. And Flux integrates with Helm in a really powerful way. Yeah, Flux is cool. It's the one where they recommend SOPs kind of out of the box. Flux supports it. You just configure it for your secret encryption and it'll work with it.
Yeah, so they bundle a SOPs operator with Flux. And so you just commit your secrets. And so how SOPs kind of works, I'll talk about it real fast, is you build a Kubernetes secrets manifest, just static manifest with, your Kubernetes secret. You use SOPs and it basically encrypts just the value field of the key value pair for the secret. Yeah. And Flux has a SOPs operator that can see that, decrypts it, and that gets inserted into Kubernetes as the secret object. So in Kubernetes, it's still like not encrypted, like it's base 64 encoded or whatever. It's not encrypted inside Kubernetes. But the nice part is that's all kind of transparent. Like you just add a little tag in your Flux config of like here's the key to use to decrypt SOPs. And it just does it when you essentially apply manifests with encrypted data in them. So that's pretty slick. It really kind of helps bridge that gap of like, what do I do with my secrets as I move to GitOps is like, if you use Flux, it kind of just handles it as long as you're okay with figuring out how Mozilla SOPs works.
Yeah, they even have a nice doc that's like, here's how you can use SOPs with Flux, which is
they will. And I'll say Flux documentation is really good.
Yeah, I love their documentation.
I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, Argo's was pretty good too.
You also mentioned the UI in Argo. So Flux doesn't have an official one, but in their docs, they actually have an FAQ. And one of the questions is, why don't you have a UI? And the answer is, check out Weave GitOps. Weave is really cool. I've been running it for a few months now, and it basically lists out all the stuff that you have in Flux with buttons to suspend or resume. It has statuses that update live as things change. And it also has like a sync button, which, checks the repository and updates any changes. So maybe that's the missing link. Weave GitOps is really cool.
If you use a lot of the stuff by Rancher, I guess they have a GitOps solution called Rancher Fleet. We don't use a lot of Rancher stuff. We use K3S in a few places personally, I think. I don't know that we've used it anywhere. Actually, no.
We have
the on-prem Kubernetes node we have that does run K3S.
It does use K3S. I love K3S. It's pretty solid.
K3S has been great.
It's a way to take Kubernetes and make it easier to start out using. So sure. I'm a big fan of it.
But no, we haven't really played with Rancher Fleet. I did try Rancher on my home infrastructure to spin up Kubernetes clusters, but at that point I was already pretty deep into Flux, so I didn't try to play with Fleet to see if it was cool or not, because I have a system that works for me, and I was changing stuff already. I didn't want to change everything. At the time, I was using a mix of Argo CD and Bitnami sealed secrets and Flux and SOPs. So there was a lot happening there for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard. I'm sure it was hard to migrate everything over. I'm glad I started with Flux, and that's kind of, I have no complaints. But I'm sure that migration was frustrating.
Yeah, it wasn't terrible. It helped that it was my personal stuff, so I could have some downtime and I could legitimately break stuff, and no one was going to yell at me. Sure. So that was nice. But yeah, I mean, like we said earlier, pick a tool, play with it. If it stops working for you, check out other tools. It's helpful if that isn't in your production environment, because that can get a little tricky. Migrating between Argo and Flux, well, I wouldn't call it painless. Migrating from one Flux repo to another, that was pretty easy, because Flux has a doc on how to do it. Yep. You can pause reconciliation, rename the the customizations and stuff, and then bring everything back up, and there's no downtime. Flux just hooks everything back up how it needs to go. Switching off of Argo wasn't that easy, because their Argo application doc objects are different than Flux's.
Yeah,
so there was some downtime there, but it's okay. Play with this stuff in a sandbox or at your house if you are that way, like both of us are.
Hey, it's so fun.
It's great. It's been great. My home infrastructure has for a long time been a sandbox for stuff I want to do at work, but don't have the time during the workday to do. And it's been great. That's how I started with Kubernetes. That's how I started with GitOps. I'm sure whatever stuff I start playing with next will be the same way.
Yeah, I've been the same way.
Having a home lab is really useful. And if you don't have a home lab, I would encourage you to think about starting one up. Usually people recommend Raspberry Pis for that. Right now, those are pretty hard to find. I've really been liking these mini PCs, like the Lenovo M900. And what was your HP one?
It's the Elite Desk 800 G2 Mini.
So for what you would pay for a Raspberry Pi 4, especially right now, you can get one of these machines. They're going to be used. So if that's not your thing, then that's fine. But one of these used machines, off eBay, they run $80-ish with usually a 256 SSD. And then what I like to do is buy $20 or $40 of memory and put in them to get up to 16 gigs. And then you've got a solid little machine for running stuff at home.
Pretty low power use too.
Yeah, I think they idle pretty low, 13, 15, 20 watts, and then under full tilt, maybe 60. But you could be in one of these machines for $100, $120. And it's x86, which isn't as great as the Pis for power sipping, but you can run everything on them.
Also, Pis have, some small issues here and there with, like USB ports interfering with Wi-Fi and stuff like that. So I love Raspberry Pis, but I think for a server, I always prefer to get something like this, at least personally.
The Raspberry Pis are super. I assume they're still hard to find. When I was looking a couple months ago, I couldn't find one. One of mine died. I had a Pi 4, it died. There was like something power related died on it, and I couldn't get it to run anymore. And I tried to find one, and I was like, well, for that price, I could be in like a Intel i5 box.
And here we are.
I think that's all we wanted to cover for GitOps. If you would like to contact us about topics we should cover, questions about topics we have covered, etc., our website is podcastascode.show, and you can contact us at contact@podcastascode.show. Our next episode will be about monitoring. So if you're interested in learning what kind of things you should be monitoring and how you can monitor those things, stay tuned for our next episode in 2 weeks.
See you next time.